choosing an Ishta Devata. Ishta Devata, just as a reminder to all of us, is that democratically chosen divine that we relate to, or being chosen by that divine, whichever way we want to put it. Ishta Devata is that personal aspect of God. There is impersonal aspect of God, which is all transcendent, incomprehensible, inconceivable. That's what Shiva here stands for. And Ishta Devata is that accessible. It's that what we can relate to. Therefore, it is spoken in that Ishta as personal, deeply personal. So the first question, there's a short background. I have been a DIY spiritual search. I have been on a DIY spiritual search for a few years now, brought on by growing awareness of my own spiritual disconnection. I have been doing Hamsa meditation daily for about 3 months, but still find feeling the heart center hard, although I am at least making slow progress there. I have been feeling the strong need to connect to, in Igor's beautiful words, personally chosen form of a deity. I understand that the act of surrender in the manner that Igor explained so well will be much easier when one is in communion with a tangible form, but I'm struggling a little in choosing who this might be. Therefore, question: can you advise me how to go about this in a culturally authentic manner, bearing in mind I come from a secular Western capitalist culture? Might as well read second question, because I think they're so connected and so related that we will benefit from giving that more of a sweeping perspective, which I think many of you will relate to. Short background. I have very little background in Indian spirituality, and so the reference in week 8 to communion with one's personally chosen form, Ishta Devata, putting one in touch with one's own force, left me with questions. Could you please explain how one who has no experience with such deities might go about making such a choice? I ask because this seems, from what you have said, to be important, and I have no idea what this might involve. Okay, so this is a good opportunity to expand our understanding on what this really means, Ishta Devata, and how to relate to that in a secular culture, and for those of us who do not have that background when this can be sort of taken for granted, so to speak. Which, by the way, you will see has a silver lining, because, as with all these things, when things are all too obvious, culturally speaking, we often take them for granted, as happens a lot in Indian culture for Indians, you see? Or in other words, in Indian culture for those who are born to that tradition, to that civilization. So Ishta Devata here does not necessarily mean, in a literal sense, a form of Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth, prosperity, and affluence, or goddess of Saraswati, who is the goddess of wisdom, knowledge, poetry, music and arts. Nor is it a dreadful looking, in dreadlocks, some kind of constantly in depressed looking state, Dhamavati, who is the goddess of the dismay, and literally what could be translated as that sense of heavy psychological burden carrying. So therefore, I want to clarify here, yes, Vedic and Tantric lore rich with these various forms of the goddess. There are many goddesses. I mean, Indian pantheon of gods probably is the richest in all the cultures in comparison. And even when narrowed down to, let's say, 10 principal goddesses, of which there's plenty references and literature out there available today. Take just David Frawley, who authored at least 2 books on that topic. There are many more scholarly accounts on these forms of Shaktis, and of course it helps to understand that these are simply spoken as forms of particular energy. Let us get back to this understanding, principal understanding. Tantra is all energy. Tantra, as a methodology, practice, and philosophy, views everything as energy. So it can be spoken in artistic terms. It can be spoken in almost medical terms. Certainly it can be spoken in scientific terms. And it can be spoken in psychological terms, in a sense of how we define a psychological makeup of an individual. Because at the base of every individual, there are certain archetypal forces of energy that are predominantly playing themselves out in the background, or rather at the forefront of what otherwise falls on the background. This what brings forth the possibility of knowing or having direct communion with one's Ishta Devata. So again, I'd like you to be very attentive here and very expansive in your understanding, not finicky about it, not just latching on something, oh yeah, okay, no, let's keep this fluid as long as we can. Don't just cast it out in deliberately made forms. So everything is energy. So therefore, at the basis of our personality, of an individuality, there are these archetypal forms. Some of the Western approaches, which are psychologically driven again, made great use of that knowledge. Maybe with greater awareness, some maybe with lesser awareness. But Tantra, of course, is known for almost extraordinary insight into what is going on at the real or behind the scenes of what plays itself out as so and so. In fact, you might have heard me speaking many times on many occasions when speaking about the phenomenon of human being, or phenomenon of individual, of being so and so, then there is no such thing. All this is ascertained simply because our culture works with these parameters. But if it's analyzed and scrutinized, dived in, perhaps with not just intellectual inference, but propped up with direct first-hand insights, that is, intuitive insights, one will begin to understand that certain energies play themselves out that altogether make up this what I consider myself to be. And the predominance of a particular energy is governed by a particular form which one can have relationship with, and in this point, or from that point of view, it is actually advised to foster that connection, to develop that connection further. In other words, to utilize that which is already there. Work with these cosmic forces. We had our retreat in California many years ago, one of the early retreats, entitled, I think, something like Universal Forms of the Goddess. Or, it might be titled something else, but there are some excerpts about this, how to work with these various forms. So this is the understanding that I welcome you to ponder on with regard to what really Ishta Devata here represents. And it's irrespective of what culture we belong to. Yes, secular culture we all share now may have a very different time with these archetypal forms of energy. Maybe there is some kind of a greater conflict. I don't know. I don't want to now move the conversation in that direction necessarily. Maybe because of the acceptance of certain values we culturally have entertained and gravitated towards more and more rapidly, brought about the possibility where certain forces had to go underground, where others are more prevalent these days. One can argue, how can one understand that very well-known folk known to every Indian peasant, archetypal force represented by the goddess Lakshmi or Mahalakshmi? Do we live in time when Mahalakshmi is now enjoying greater spectacle than Saraswati, the goddess of wisdom and arts and knowledge? Hard to tell, you see, because we would have to be really honest and unscrupulous and unbiased to look into this in as direct manner as possible. Lakshmi is not only expresses herself in the donations at the altar, not just in newly born saris and richly cooked food with a lot of honey or sugar in it. Lakshmi expresses herself in those white boats where each meter costs 1 million. So if you have a 40-meter boat, it's 40 million. And if you dock your boat and it's 1 meter longer, which potentially could cause a dent in your ego, because your boat is not the biggest in the bay, then you know that you are not the main shot in town. Isn't that all also somehow forms of that goddess? Has to be. You see, so really, these archetypal forces are always at play and displaying themselves in ways that sometimes is bewildering and incomprehensible. So as I said, that in itself is a vast and perhaps very interesting topic. How these archetypal forces are now playing themselves out, and what is our part in all this unfoldment. What do we understand by affluence? You see? Can there be only Lakshmi worshipped if other forms of Shakti are being somehow driven away, that Cinderella style? Again, another interesting one. But going back to these actual questions, right? Because the questions simply here. So how can one go about this? I would say that it's a matter of getting to know oneself and not being afraid to recognize traits of one's personality that have been a driven factor in your life. And you'll be amazed. As rational as this may sound, this is a direct and honest approach So there are principal archetypal forces, just as there are principal, let's say, Shaktis in that pantheon of Shaktis, 10, all of them. You know, I would not be able to maybe recollect all of them, but you know, it's all not just Lakshmi Saraswati. It's of course Kali and her form as Durga, you know, and there are all not just the dreadful Humavati, but there are other benevolent forms, neutral forms, but forms that also inform us of other aspects in our psyche. In a way, this is tantric psychology. So no state of mind, no emotional state is here without the direct influence of these energies and how these energies play themselves out in our life and how we perceive this, live this directly, are without them being at the background, but really the movers and shakers of what is being experienced by us. You see? So this is already a direct hint to you of what Ishta Devata there, of that personal aspect of God. Because this is direct in a sense that it's authentic and honest. I had, for example, people, we went through some phase in our Sangha, in our community, earlier on, where I have renamed quite a few of my dedicated students. Only those who have declared their studentship and often welcomed, in some cases asked for it, to be renamed. There were some really sweet, rather funny cases when so-and-so would come to me and say, aren't you going to rename me at this live event? You know, like so-and-so have been renamed and I'm still carrying my birth name and, you know, I want to be renamed. And I said, yeah, well, you know, let's see how it goes, you know, it's just of like, you know, spiritual teachers known for being nasty characters when it comes to teasing. So a fair amount of teasing will go into it. When someone would just come and astonish me, well, when you will think of what name to give me, I have great connection to this goddess, let's say, goddess of wisdom. Can you give me the name that somehow affiliated with that goddess? Because that's what I feel. This I want to warn you against, or rather simply bring this to your awareness, that it's not what we fancy, but what actually playing itself out. We may fancy at that level where a lot of stuff is not available to our conscious awareness. And this is what makes things so interesting, you see? One may think of oneself to, oh, I worship knowledge, and that's all I want. Knowledge and knowledge and knowledge and nothing else. When in fact one worships money without knowing it, or fame without knowing it. You see? And particularly when it comes to the professions where that recognition is inseparable from that what expresses itself, becomes very difficult to draw the line, whether be it a world of science, right? Scholarly world, drama, actors, acting, right? Anything to do with arts, anything to do with anything where something is being expressed in that more obvious way. And the same goes for writers, poets, writers, people who, men and women of letters. You don't need to come from the Indian spirituality. So these deities simply ought to be recognized in the makeup of who we are and sense into it. You can journal, you can have retrospective perspective of what moved you through life the most. And then you have to be brutally honest with yourself if you can afford to do that. So many of us, when are faced with truth, are either often callously move into the opposite direction or begin to fabricate narrative, which is a waste of time, especially if this is done for one's own sake. You see? There's no shame at all in being here an expression of any of the divine energies, because all of them are divine without exception. So this is what I would suggest to you. And maybe another helpful hint here. What if my Ishta Devata is more from that family of dreadful ones? Less glamorous, certainly not this and that, not the one who would like to be seen walking, promenading in public places. Well, guess what? That can be an astonishing revelation which will make you a true artist. This is the true mark of a genius, to be able to draw from that what society considers to be unacceptable, below, somehow lower than. Then you tap into this, what is truly, truly constitutes real work when we speak of tantric approach. Because in Tantra there is no low and high. This is the rule of a thumb. And understanding then one's makeup in terms of one's predispositions frees oneself from the pangs of not being able to fit into that happy or lucky happy go ever after. I've given this example before, so forgive me for recycling it, those of you who have heard it, but I will do it nevertheless here again. There is a scene in Andrei Tarkovsky's movie called Nostalgia, which he shot in Italy. And in that scene, a character, a hero of that story, a Russian poet in immigration, experiencing pangs of nostalgia for his homeland, family, wife. And he has to be in exile. Tarkovsky is notorious for not giving a literally narrative. He is not interested in why this happened and what happened and why he said this. He is not interested in this. Therefore, he is timeless in terms of what he here tackles. He belongs to that cinema of Kurosawa, Satyajit Ray, Antonioni, Kubrick. You see? So, very old cinematography, but beautifully shot. There is this scene, he is in this grotto of some kind of therme, some kind of hot springs. And in that old grotto, he has this, he goes there, often there is this dog and there is this child comes who speaks Italian, and he speaks to himself, and there is this monologue when he goes into the water in his clothes up to his almost, I don't know, certainly up to his shin, and he gives that story of how someone looked as if they are drowning in a pond, and a passerby rushes to save them, starts to throw ropes at them and starts telling them, hey, here's the stick, come on, like, I need to save you, I need to help you, get out of there, man, look at you, you're all wet, you're about to drown, you this and that, you're looking unhappy. And the guy just goes, man, I live here. So this, of course, you can, see that also is part of that very Russian archetypal psyche that Tarkovsky's character here represents. I live here. In other words, this makeup what you perceive outside with your perception as being not worthy or somehow below of merit, or somehow you feel I'm feeling wet, maybe cold, maybe uncomfortable, is in fact a place where I'm the most at home. This is a paradoxically major question that film brings also, along with other ones, in terms of how Western values have been imposed repeatedly on the rest of the world, on every single fucking culture without exception. Certain set of values, mostly with the set of comforts, certain physiological comforts, because they're not even psychological comforts, that have been repeatedly imposed on other cultures because it felt by those educators that you need to be saved, you see? So this is a reminder of how to work potentially with the archetypal forces, because you may have that propensity for a melancholy, these blue moods. It doesn't mean that you're depressed. A certain aspect of the goddess singing her quiet whisper-like song through you, and you might be a poet in disguise. Don't have to be a poet. You might be an engineer, a graphic designer, whatever, I don't care. The point is being made, so that you don't immediately jump into conclusions like that person did, who asked me to name her Saraswati because she felt that spiritual knowledge and wisdom and arts is what she's all about. Far from it. So, we'll move on, and the next is energy flows.